Stephanie, would you like to start by telling us about your work?
Because I'm also an introvert, I have some notes written down just so that I can remember what I wanted to tell you all you wonderful folks. So if you look closely at this picture, you'll notice in the middle of the picture, there are enslaved people and they are being exposed for sale. But if you look at the crowd, what I immediately noticed as a budding historian of women in slavery were the number of women present in the image. And this picture to me really kind of personifies the history of women's economic investments in slavery. Because historians have used this picture in their books. They've used it as a book cover. It's ubiquitous in historical scholarship, and yet few, if any, scholars have attended to the way that the many women in this book, in this image, appear there. So for a long time, scholars have ignored or outright dismissed women's economic investments in the continued oppression of African Americans. And when they did come across women who seemed deeply invested in American slavery, they would explain their activities away. But I wanted to consider these women seriously and on their own terms. I wanted to understand the extent to which women, particularly the women that are considered white in America, were involved in the purchase, sale, and hire of enslaved African Americans. So one of the central collections, archival collections that I used were these wonderful interviews conducted by the US federal government with formerly enslaved African Americans during the 1930s and 1940s. And this is just the first page of one of those interviews. And just from the first page, it's a rich document. Millie Simpkins, who was enslaved in Nashville, Tennessee, tells us an extraordinary story about not just who enslaved her, but the conditions under which she was enslaved, the conditions under which she was sold, the circumstance, the location of where she was sold, information about her parents, but more importantly for my research interests, she tells us a lot about the woman who owned her. She tells us that the woman was rich, that she sold her because she was stubborn, et cetera, et cetera. So I used these kinds of interviews to try to understand from the formerly enslaved person's perspective how deeply invested in the economy, so the buying and purchasing and the hiring of enslaved people, how deeply invested white women were in the economic dimensions of the institution of slavery. And these interviews were absolutely critical to being able to find women like Millie Simpkins' mistress, who you see in this image here, and on the left-hand side, using information like the information that Millie Simpkins provided in her interview, I was able to then track and trace these women in other kinds of documents. So this is a snapshot from the US federal census from 1860. So here is Millie's mistress, along with Millie's mistress's family members. So I was able to use the details that Millie Simpkins provided to then find her mistress, find slave-owning women in other documents, such as these, and we'll probably talk more about sources during our conversation with Karma, with my conversation with Karma and Rita. And so what we also find in these interviews are extraordinary pictures, images of the formerly enslaved. So this is a formerly enslaved woman named Mary Kinshian Edwards, and what she was able to tell me about her mistress was that her mistress compelled her to serve as a wet nurse to her white infant at the expense of her own children. And so listening to what people like Mary Kinshian Edwards told me, I was able to then ask questions that wouldn't be possible without these formerly enslaved people's testimony. And so the question that I asked in relationship to Mary Kinshian Edwards' story was, if she served as a wet nurse, an enslaved wet nurse, how many other enslaved women served in this capacity, and how instrumental were white women in creating a demand for these women's labor. So what I decided to do is to look in the place where I didn't expect to find any answers, and that was in local newspapers. So when I looked in local newspapers, I found advertisements like the ones that you see on the right-hand side, which advertise for the purchase or hire or sale of enslaved women who served in the capacity of wet nurses like Mary Kinchy and Edwards. And finally, going deeply into the testimony of formerly enslaved people also led me to ask what kinds of information could I acquire in the Civil War era. And so this particular advertisement is what's called a lost friends ad. So during the Civil War and right after the American Civil War, formerly enslaved people would place advertisements in local newspapers to try to find the lost loved ones that they had been separated from during their enslavement. And so this advertisement was posted by Caroline Mason, who is looking for her sister and her nieces and her nephew who had been sold away from her by her mistress, Mrs. Mason. So what she does is she's very insistent on, very emphatic about the fact that it is this woman who is responsible for her pain and her trauma and the pain and trauma of her sibling and her nieces and nephew. So what I wanted to do is to center the voices of enslaved and formerly enslaved people in my work to tell the story of white women's economic investments in their continued oppression and subjugation. And so with that, I will conclude so that we can talk more about this in our conversation and pass it on to Karma. Thank you.
And Karma, let us hear from you now.
Thank you very much. So, hello everyone. I'm a historian of religion. More specifically, I'm an intellectual historian studying religious ideas and theology. I'm teaching at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem at the Department for Comparative Religion. And I'm also a graduate of Tel Aviv University, so I've been following the Dan David Prize and the way it has been transformed and changed and grew throughout the years. So I'm really excited to be part of this amazing project and to be here with you. So what I'm interested in is basically how religious agents give and take. How did they negotiate their religious, so the ancient traditions within new historical context, new cultural and also political contexts, more specifically within processes of secularization, of liberalization, if we're talking about the contemporary setting, and I'm a contemporary historian, so also the post-liberal setting or the crisis of liberalism, and everything that is happening in the world, especially the Western world after World War II. And we'll go back to the Holocaust later because it's very central. And I think that one of the most important places, fascinating places or lens to study these questions is when we're thinking about groups that reorganize not only their own traditions, but also their interactions with other groups and with other traditions. So secular, non-religious, and religious people, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, they keep reorienting and rearranging their interactions. Again, and it changes within a different contexts. Of course, if you can just imagine two different places, you will see how the relationships are extremely different in these places. There are different pacts, different connections that are made, different points of references, and of course the relationship between majority and minority is very central here. So power relations, how secularization in every context, how it looks like also impacts how the religious communities perceive themselves and their attitudes towards other religious communities. So, and when we were thinking about contemporary religion, I think that one of the immediate concepts that we come up with, that we associate with contemporary religion, is the concept of rapprochement, of interreligious dialogue, right? Interfaith dialogue. We're living in an age of interfaith dialogue, so to say, even though there is really thin historical research on what this dialogue means. So this is still in the beginning, and we're starting to see historiography about this. But basically, this is just something that we know from our lives, and the common narrative is somehow that we have this moment of reconciliation, a moment of a new era. Religions used to despise each other, but now everything seems to be fine. So somehow with the liberal setting, and this really is a post-war issue, religious communities found a way to accept each other and to live more calmly with each other than ever before. So the main question that drives my research is how is this at all possible? This very neat, this clear change of era. What is reconciliation made of? What are the building blocks, so to say, of this reconciliation? And also, what are the prices that this process charges or takes from each party, from each part of this dialogue or reconciliation process? And if we're talking about dialogue, then also what are we dialoguing and what remains silenced? And this is actually a very central topic. So if to go to the very small PowerPoint that I prepared, no, that's not the, okay, sorry. Okay. Simple things can be complicated, as you know. Historians should know that, right? So, so this is my big project, my book, on which I've worked for many years in many geographical contexts, but also intellectual contexts. It started here in Tel Aviv and continued in Rome, in California, and also in Berlin. And of course, in each of these contexts, religion and also Jewish-Christian relations mean something completely different. So I had to rewrite and rethink the project many times according to the context. And during this project, I tried to examine one of the symbols of interreligious reconciliation. So you can probably imagine a cardinal or a bishop in a red cape that are taking a photo with a bearded Orthodox rabbi, right? This is a very symbolic event. Or we can imagine, sometimes we hear about those kosher meals in the Vatican, or the Pope that is leaning forward and putting a note in the Western wall. So what is going on there? How does it happen? And more importantly, how does this correspond with our own perception of what religion is and what is its place in our societies? For example, is this a photo of this dialogue between the bearded rabbi and the Catholic bishops? Do they also recapture somehow a perception according to which religion is perhaps the source of violence, and a secular world would be, or a liberal world would be, what suggests, what offers to religion to somehow retreat from violence and perhaps leave its political claims aside? So what is behind this, these images? And another question is, do Jews and Christians, and they are at the focus of my research, do they come into this business with the same motivation? Do they pay the same prices? Do they have the same aspirations about dialogue, the same goals? Yeah, so this is a caricature that was once in the Haaretz newspaper when my book came out in Hebrew, and I think it's very precise in the very thin humor that we see here, and we see how the positionality, or the thing that this image really brings out a difference, right, between how contemporary Christian communities and certain contemporary Jewish communities approach the Jewish-Christian relationship, well, we see, I don't even have to explicate this, but John Paul II's expression, I think, stands for itself. And those Orthodox rabbis were a bit suspicious here towards the interaction. And so this is really part of the question, whether we expect somehow Jewish communities to jump, so to say, on the wagon of Jewish-Christian dialogue in a way that, so what makes us think that this is going to be so simple in a way. So what characterizes my approach is that in order to understand the interreligious dynamic, specifically between Catholics and Jews, one has to really deal with worlds which are entirely and deeply different from each other. To see on the one hand a world that is rich in gestures, like what we see here when we think about John Paul II's visit to Auschwitz in 1978, and on the other hand, we also have to dive into the meticulous halachic discussion of the Orthodox community, and these are two languages that actually don't have any relationship in a way, and this lack of relationship this is of course the whole story, that to tell these different stories together makes the story very different, and this is exactly the kind of history that I am interested in. So just to conclude, what happens when we look at different languages together, religious languages, secular languages, and how does this shed light on the way we perceive religion and perhaps also civilization in general. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you both so much. Can you hear me? Thank you both so very much. I wonder if we could begin by each of you telling us, maybe with a little bit more, I don't know, granular detail, how or why you came to the projects that you came to, how and why you came to the historical projects that you came to, how you came upon the sources that you used, why you decided to use them, why you decided to treat them in one way as opposed to another way. So could I ask you, Stephanie?
Sure. So I was in graduate school, and I'm a specialist in African American history, so I was training as a specialist in African American history. But I was also very interested in the history of women and gender, and so I was taking coursework in the history of women and gender as well. And so what I noticed was that the story that these two fields, these subfields of history, were telling about white women's economic investments in roles in American slavery seemed to be very different. And so I was frustrated by this disconnect between what historians of women were saying and what historians of the African American experience were saying. The historians of the African American experience were saying that enslaved people and formerly enslaved people kind of situated and centered white women as central actors in their oppression. Whereas the historians, particularly those that focused on white Southern American women, were saying that women had a very indirect relationship to the institution of slavery, that, you know, they might have been socially or ideologically invested in the institution of slavery, but they weren't directly invested, particularly in the economic dimensions of the institution of slavery. And so I wanted to kind of resolve this, you know, this disconnect. I wanted to explore this disconnect more intricately. And so I posed the question, you know, who's right here, you know? And so what I noticed immediately was that these two subfields of history were using different sources. Those individuals who explored the lives of white Southern American women were using diaries and letters, but those individuals who explored the experiences of African Americans in the 19th century, in the 1800s, they were looking at the kind of interviews that I talked about in my presentation. So they were looking at the actual testimony of the formerly enslaved, and they were telling the story that the formerly enslaved were telling about white women's deep and economic investments in the institution of slavery. So, historians always talk about reading sources against the grain, and so in this way I was reading a collection of interviews against the grain, because typically historians, when they focus on these interviews with formerly enslaved African Americans, they want to understand the experience of slavery from those sources. But what I wanted to understand was what slavery was like through the eyes of the enslaved at the hands of white women. And I thought that the best way to get at that question was to listen to and take my cues from the formerly enslaved. And so in that way, I approached these sources from a different lens, from a different vantage point than most historians had done before, because I was asking about white women through the eyes of enslaved people, as opposed to just trying to focus on the enslaved experience through the eyes of the enslaved.
So I did my MA on Augustine and his anti-Donatist controversy, and I fell in love with political theology and with the question of how politics and religion influence each other. And then I had this gut feeling that religion is still somehow important. Perhaps it is important to to study contemporary religion as well, which was back then a weird thing to do, especially in Tel Aviv University, because it has been somehow, especially Christianity, related more to ancient stuff. And I didn't realize, which is of course always a question of how we respond to the zeitgeist somehow. But this came out. My feeling was actually well connected with the idea of the post-secular turn, exactly when the thesis of secularization started to collapse, and sociologists and historians and philosophers began to realize that indeed religion is still important in everything we thought about it, that it's going down and fading away into the private sphere is not exactly as we expected, and perhaps we should change the paradigm. So very interestingly, I found myself doing something which was actually part of a greater project without understanding this. And then the second phase, so after deciding to go modern or postmodern, whatever, so to say, the next step was that I thought I want to do something about Jewish-Christian relations, but I really didn't know anything about Jewish-Christian relations, except from Jeremy Cohen's books, perhaps. And then I realized that I first learned on Nostra Aetate, which is the Second Vatican Council's declaration, in which the fourth section is about Jews and Judaism, and I was totally surprised. Why should Catholics even think about Jews today? Isn't this something that really belongs to the past? Why this is even relevant at all? And gradually I understood that part of this amazement that I sensed was exactly what I want to study. So how come I didn't know? What are the preconditions that allowed me somehow to not know about something like that? So this is probably because I have certain perceptions of religion, of secularization, etc. And then, with encouragement of my advisor, I realized that it's not only this post-Vatican II moment that I'm interested in. So how come today, how do things look like from the Catholic perspective today in terms of theology? But something that we know even less about is what do Jews have to say about this about this new initiative of the Catholic Church to reconcile with them, to reach out to them and make things better. So why don't we know what Jews think? And how does one measure what Jews think? And it's not as easy. I guess this is how things started.
Thank you both so much. Actually, what you both show is how the best historical work emerges out of frustration. Frustration with the historical narratives, frustration with the ways in which the sources are presented to you. Actually, frustration with the ways in which you can understand modernity through the past, or the past through modernity. And so you've both given me a perfect segue to the next kind of question that I wanted to ask you, and it's about time. It's about your temporal relationship with the project, but our temporal relationships with the pasts that you both, or presents that you both study. So for both of you, in some ways, the past is utterly present. It is present in Stephanie's work, and the past figures crucially in the way that Karma understands the relationship between 1960s reconciliation moves all the way up to 2013, which is where you take your project. And so one could ask the question, how past is the past? But I think both of you have shown me a better way to ask that question, because you're both dealing with very difficult subjects. You're both dealing with trauma and traumatic experience. And so the key question might be reckoning. So in what ways do you understand our reckoning with the past as it continues to unfold into the present? So would you like to start, Stephanie?
Well, I don't think that America has fully reckoned with the history of slavery at all. Not in the ways that I think would be productive and helpful for the society. I'm often, asked, like, why women? Why talk about women? By talking about women in slavery, what do we learn about the present? Why even have this conversation? And so, what I often, talk about is the fact that there are all these moments in American history where white women in particular do really interesting things, really surprising things. And people seem to think that it's these behaviors just come out of nowhere. But I think by studying the history of women in slavery, we learn why they were deeply invested in white supremacy in particular moments throughout American history, for example. We learn why these women may have, in fact, some of the descendants of these women voted for a man who, stands for everything that women should not stand for, right? So I think by looking at the relationship that the economic and legal relationships that women had to slavery allows for us to also understand their deep investments in white supremacy, and thus how those moments that I talk about, for example, women are involved in lynching rituals during the early 1900s, the lynching of African American men, women, and children. Why? They're deeply invested in white supremacy. They're deeply invested in the segregation of schools, and they fight for continued segregation of American schools. Why? Because they're deeply invested in white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. So there are these moments that I think can be very much connected to this past. And so it's a usable past, I think. And so I don't think we've fully reckoned with, to go back to your question, I don't think we've fully reckoned with this past, in large part because, and this is something that I said recently in conversation with some really wonderful folks, that, we need to hold on to hope that at least half of humanity are the good ones. And we hope that women are that good half. Unfortunately, we are sadly disappointed if we look at this particular part of the past. But I'm rambling at this point, so I'll just hand it over to Karma.
Thank you so much. No, that was really informative. You're not rambling. Thank you. Please, Karma.
Thanks. I also have something that is perhaps connected, but let's go back to that. So I want to answer about the past, whether it's past, and also about the question of reckoning. And I want to split my answer into two halves. So I might forget about reckoning if you can remind me. Great. Thanks. Okay. So, of course, when we're talking about religion, and especially institutionalized religions like Catholicism, like Orthodox Judaism, So the whole point is how to leave the past alive, right? That's these communities which are very present. Their vitality is somehow dependent, and also their ability to change is somehow dependent of finding new paths towards the past and leaving the past somehow alive. So when someone studies religion, this is always, this negotiation between past and present is really always the case. And when we're talking about reconciliation, so, Jewish-Christian relations after the Holocaust, the narrative that we have in mind, as I already mentioned before, is of a break between the past, right? So centuries of mutual hostility are now thrown into the the garbage can of history, and now everything is fantastic. So there is this very, very clear break. And when one looks at the sources, it's very interesting to see how the polemical moment or remnants of the previous take on Jewish-Christian relations, how they find the ways into this conciliatory path. So one very strong example, an example that the name of my book, the title of my book is also reverberating in a way, is when we think about John Paul II going to the synagogue in Rome and claiming that the Jews are our very beloved brothers. In a certain sense, they are our older brothers, right? The fratelli maggiori moment. And when we visit Rome, when I visit Rome as an Israeli, sometimes people just say, "Ah, fratelli maggiori." So this is really a very strong symbol somehow. But when we think about this idea of older brothers, of course, the entire Jewish-Christian polemic, this was always a central theme. Who is the older brother? Nobody wants to be the older brother. It's the worst thing to be the older brother, to be Esau. Everybody wants to be Jacob, right? And this already originates in Paul. And somehow when John Paul II says that, and it's really great, and you see that he has good intentions, and that the setting enables this saying to have a whole different meaning than what it used to be, but still this polemical baggage is somehow there. And I found this in various sources, both Jewish sources and Christian sources, and this is really a recurring theme. So that's in terms of the question of the past and whether it's really past. And now I remember myself to talk about reckoning. So very interestingly, this word, reckoning, is totally absent in Jewish-Christian relations and in Jewish-Christian dialogue, interfaith dialogue more generally. And we always talk about reconciliation, which is a very charged theological word. So why is it that we're talking about reconciliation and not about reckoning? And why is this idea that we really have to become some kind of a whole? This is something that I find extremely interesting, and I would also say, and I think this relates to what you just said, Stephanie, is that it seems to me that there is, at least in circles of Jewish-Christian dialogue, that there is a certain resistance to cope with Jewish rage, because rage still has something a bit ugly in it, and somehow, you know, after World War II, when we think about Judaism, it's especially because of the theological baggage that is related to Jewish rage, right? Judaism is supposed to be free of rage, totally acceptable somehow, and it seems to me that reckoning somehow is perhaps a better concept, also to cope with this negative baggage that is still very active there. So I'm hoping to reclaim reckoning to this setting as well.
Thank you both so much. And of course, reckoning, the term reckoning itself, comes with so much ethical baggage and also a kind of injunction to do something. I'm not sure that there is something that can be done, but there is a huge ethical value simply in resetting the narrative. I mean, giving us a new narrative, giving us a new direction in the narrative, which you've both done in the work that you offer us. And here, actually, I want to ask about the ways in which you have been able to rethink the archive. So we can go even deeper and deeper into your projects. So you are both interpreters of the written record, or at least of the verbal record that is then written down. You're both interpreters of storytelling, different kinds of storytelling. The records of the interviews from the 1930s, Stephanie, those amazing WPA-sponsored interviews, absolutely amazing. And for Karma, the records of, and the substantial records of theological controversy, this side, that side, very, very deep records. This is not just a question of how did you approach your sources, but a question of how you approach your sources in terms of what has lain invisible, the impediments to full disclosure, and you're going to have very different kinds of answers to this, but can you talk a little bit about what has lain hidden? What have you had to do a lot of work to bring to light and to re-narrativize for us? I don't know which of you wants to start.
Yes,
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm just thinking how did I even build? So what were the sources that how this started to have a structure in my mind? And when you look into Jewish-Christian dialogue, it seems very obvious. What are the main sources that one has to look into? And this is especially declarations, which is, yeah, it's kind of a tedious genre, I would say sometimes, and it returns on very specific notions. So this is how I started looking into what comes up when one thinks of Jewish-Christian dialogue. But then exactly the idea was that, first of all, Jewish communities don't really use this genre of declarations. It's not something that in the intra-Jewish discourse, this is not how things work. So this already puts one in a very specific circles of participants. And I didn't want to examine what is there, what's the obvious content of this dialogue, but also what's absent, what's excluded. And this is how it started to really go wild, in the sense that it was also interesting to see what's the intra-communal discourse on the other. So the intra-Jewish discourse on Christians and the intra-Christian discourse on Jews, when the other is not really listening, and you can use your own language and you're free to speak undiplomatically. And this changed everything. And then another issue was that also in each of the communities, there are various sources that point to different directions. So there are those declarations, and there are also those historical gestures, which I already mentioned. But then you have on the internet things that are completely different than heavy theological work. And you have those heavy theologians that have nothing to do with Jewish-Christian relations, and they always say only something really coincidental, so to say, about it. And those that this is the center of their work, and they speak really differently than those who deal with it marginally. So there is an entire power structure within the community that one has to examine and to see, not only to read sources, but how do they relate to each other, how do they contradict each other, how do they stand in tension with each other. And the same was true also for the Jewish community, the Orthodox community, and of course I really did focus on non-liberal communities, and that's not a coincidence. And so I think the hardest sources to conquer, so to say, was the halachic discourse. First and foremost, because they never speak very overtly on Christianity, so you have to know the codes and also the history in order to understand what at all are they, what they are talking about when they say okay, so these sources, the shituf sources, and there is a controversy. It's an entire, and we are going with Maimonides, so you have to know the entire medieval spectrum in order to understand, because it's all encoded in this language. And this was really eye-opening for me to understand that in order to understand contemporary debates, one has to know the history of this relationship, because otherwise you just don't understand a thing. You only understand good intentions or less good intentions, but that's, yeah.
Thank you. Please, Stephanie.
So I'll first just want to start by saying that these interviews are considered very fraught. They're considered controversial amongst some historians because of a variety of factors. One, the individuals who were being interviewed were often very old, and so there are ideas or thoughts that they might not remember very clearly their experiences in slavery. The other argument is that the interview context was very tense because many of the interviewers were white Southerners, often descendants of American slave owners, and thus the formerly enslaved might feel intimidated, might feel reticent to share the kind of fullness of their experiences with these individuals. But what I wanted to do is, yes, approach these sources, these interviews with caution, but also, approach them with a set of different kinds of questions. And one of the questions that I asked in approaching these sources was, I found all of this evidence that, enslaved people argued that white women were deeply invested in their oppression, deeply invested in the buying, the selling, and the hiring of enslaved people. And if they were deeply invested in all these ways, were they also deeply invested in the dimensions of slavery that we often attribute to white men, sexual violence? And so I asked this question of the sources, and the sources spoke to me. These individuals spoke to me. They told me that not only were white Southern women complicit in acts of sexual violence against them, but that they orchestrated circumstances that made the sexual violence perpetrated against them possible in the first place. And so in terms of hidden information in these sources, it was there. It was there all the time. But because I approached these sources with different questions, yes, with caution, but with different questions, I was able to uncover evidence of a phenomenon that no other scholar had really, uncovered in this way, had talked about in the way that I talk about it. So I was able to not only pinpoint that, but also ask, how else were women involved in the kind of sexual violation of enslaved people? And so I learned that white Southern American women owned brothels, and they put enslaved women to work in those brothels. So in this way, I argue that these women were considered slave traders of a different stripe because they sold these women over and over and over again to various clients. And by doing that, they profited multiple times from the sale of these enslaved women's bodies. So what I wanted to do was to uncover, again, this kind of hidden history of women's deep involvement in the sexual violation of women, because the sexual violation of enslaved women was part and parcel of the system of slavery. It was absolutely fundamental to the institution of slavery. And I was able to uncover, by asking these different questions, the role that white Southern American women played in that part of the history.
It's really obvious from hearing both of you that there's a moment of surrendering to the sources if you are quiet enough, if you're silent enough, and if you come in obliquely. You're not trying to kind of take over the sources and own them, but you actually allow those sources to reveal themselves. You produce an entirely different kind of narrative. So, I mean, one might ask you what was frustrating about your sources, and maybe you could, you could talk about that. But it actually sounds to me as if you had a relationship with your sources that was at once very respectful. You want to create, of course, a coherent narrative because you owe it to the material to create a coherent narrative. But on the other hand, you're not going to kind of steamroll over your sources in such a way as to extract a coherent narrative where it doesn't live, right? So there's a kind of mutuality, I suppose, between the researcher and their sources, and so I kind of want to change subject, but just slightly. This is something very close to my heart, and it's going to be very close to the hearts of many people in this audience. How do you see the research that you've done, the work that you've done, the archival work that you've done, in terms of changing the way that you teach history? So do you, and there, I don't have an agenda there. We really just want to know what kinds of, in what ways has it, you could say it changed your classroom, but also just changed the kind of ethical dimension of your teaching, or simply your classroom affect. So which one of you would like to start? I don't know, shall I pick one of you? Okay, go ahead.
So I'm wondering if it will be okay that I will slightly transform the way you pose the question and answer instead how my teaching influenced the way I do research instead of the opposite. Because I think in my case, I had the opportunity to teach both in Israel and in Germany, and a little bit also in Rome. And this really changed the way I accessed these religious sources. So, as I already mentioned, so in Israel, when one teaches these things, we have in the university this secular position from which we are approaching the sources. We're completely objective, though we know that there is no such thing, but we still are very much objective. This is how we usually see ourselves. So there is a distance in terms of teaching the sources. Of course, teaching Christianity in Israeli institutions, not so much Jewish-Christian relations, but Christianity per se, is also, it's still a bit provocative. So students that like provocative want to study these things, especially if they're religious, and this is the first time they open the New Testament, for example. And others feel a bit awkward about it. So this also happens, but still there is this distance. And then I started teaching at a theological faculty in Germany, a Protestant theological faculty, and there, in a way, every encounter was an interfaith encounter without me, the objective historian, meaning for this to be so, but it was impossible to somehow discharge, this tension that was always a part of the class there. And in a way, I was, called to represent Judaism. And in Israel, nobody would ever think of me as a good representative. And this was a very interesting experience, but I think what I learned from that as a historian was that we're part of the experiment, whether we're religious or not. Historians are part of the experiment, especially in contemporary history, but not only, I think. Somehow the way we also should look into our own positionalities. This is how we should be aware of how we depict the narratives, because these narratives in each cultural context, they demand a different narration. And the difference between the Israeli and the German context was very, very strong for me. And also between the comparative religion approach and the theology approach. So in a way, I'm not sure what is exactly, how to formulate the lesson that I've learned from this. But first of all, I understood to what extent these materials are alive and how they touch identities of people in ways that I couldn't imagine when I was still, in this comparative religion Israeli approach, which makes me perhaps more nuanced and more delicate in terms of understanding the sensibilities that are involved.
Thank you so much.
And so I want to kind of marry Karma's question, her reformulation of your question, and your question together, because, I learn from my students. I approach my students as scholars, as individuals that I can learn from, because I don't know it all. So I go into the classroom with an open heart and an open mind, thinking about my students as scholars who I can learn from, who might actually push me to do more with my own work, to inspire me to ask questions of the sources that I hadn't thought to ask before. And that is in fact what happened. I was teaching a course on African American history, and one of my students, and I happened to be talking about African American motherhood and motherhood under slavery. And so one of my students asked, I was talking about wet nursing. And so one of my students asked, well, if these women are wet nursing their own children, other women's children, what's happening with their children, and, what's going on here. And so she was really confused. She had never heard of this. But her line of questioning led me to the question of, whether this was a widespread enough practice, a common enough practice, that there would actually be a market, that a niche market would evolve in wet nurses and enslaved wet nurses. And in fact, an entire chapter came out of that kind of thought process, thinking with my student, thinking about her questions very seriously. And so on the flip side, to answer your question about how my research has kind of shaped my teaching, I developed an entire course in large part because of my fascination with women who defy all of our expectations. These women, in a variety of ways, defy the expectations of their time. And I wondered how many women over the course of American history have defied expectations, whether those be legal expectations, religious expectations, etc. So I developed a course called Defiant Women and decided to just develop an entire course that took up this question. So each week is a different theme of defiance and a theme of female resistance. And so the students love the class. It's been as large as 300 students. It's been as small as 60. It started out as 60, but it's kind of quadrupled each time I've taught it. So it's a very popular course. And it came from my interest in these slave-owning women and their kind of defiance and resistance of the norms of their time.
That's a perfect segue to the next question I was going to ask you. Thank you both very much. I really love the way that you reformulate the question, flip the question, marry the question. I think it's brilliant. Thank you so much. This is actually something that you were thinking about earlier. Because of the nature of what you deal with, you're inevitably going to develop certain kinds of, as it were, personal relations with the subjects of your research. There's something, in a way, I want to say almost performative about the way that about the research that you do. So I just wonder, what kinds of, as it were, intimacies do you feel that you develop with the subjects of your research?
Well, as an African-American woman, the descendant of enslaved people, I took my work very personally. This work was very personal for me. I thought that the work was about justice. It was about doing justice to the experiences of the formerly enslaved, to my ancestors. So in that way, a very kind of practical, kind of obvious way, this was very personal for me. But what I also found was that, I didn't fall in love. Some historians of Southern women clearly fell in love with their subjects because they write about them as though they were, best friends with these women. And I didn't have that kind of relationship with these women, to say the least. But what I did find is that I was sympathetic to some of their circumstances. And so, that intimacy, seeing into their lives, through their letters, through their correspondence, also through what enslaved people said about what happened in their lives. For example, formerly enslaved people talked about white women, white Southern American women enduring domestic violence, so being, threatened with shotguns, being whipped with the same whips that enslaved people were being whipped with. So those kinds of reflections allow for me to sympathize in some ways with these white Southern women. So in a very kind of obvious way, I'm very, very connected to this work. But in a kind of indirect way, I was able to kind of connect with these women and sympathize with them in some dimensions of their lives, though not all.
I think it got me confused in a way, especially because there are these two narratives in my work, in this book, and sometimes more narratives. So in more recent work, I also try to engage both non-religious accounts and religious accounts, and to add more perspectives to the research. And in a way, it leaves me somehow unable to identify with anything, or able to sometimes identify with theologians that you wouldn't. First of all, why should I identify with theologians at all? But sometimes I really feel that I can sympathize with a conservative Catholic perspective, and just the next moment I can really despise it. So it really, it's very difficult. In a way, I think it changed my intellectual identity into something that is much more negative than anything else. I can't say anything positive about anything, more or less. I don't know if this is if this makes sense.
It makes sense to me. I think it would be really difficult to write about the history of theological controversy without disagreeing with people, finding myself causing, really causing disagreement with myself. I have one. Oh, please.
Just to comment on that. Yeah, but you also disagree somehow with yourself, especially when you learn how theologians, for example, see secularism and secularization. You want to take their criticism seriously, and you're actually the one that is being criticized. So instead of being the scientist that looks at these religious remnants, you're suddenly the remnant that is being looked at from a theological perspective, and this is really confusing.
Do we have time for one more question to them? Or are we... okay, one more question. And this is actually a question that you both wanted to talk about. So what's the next question for you?
So my next project is almost an extension of this. It goes back further in time to the 17th and 18th centuries, and it spreads across 3 continents. So it goes to London and Liverpool and Bristol, so in England, and it goes to West Africa, then it goes to the British Caribbean, and then to North America. And so what it is it's a women's history of the British Atlantic slave trade. So the experience of the Atlantic slave trade through women's eyes, women's English women, African women, and Afro-English women's experiences.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say that somehow the prize, I think what it brings in me is this enthusiasm about giving freedom to my theoretical urge that I felt that I somehow need to keep in check until now. So I'm planning to go theoretical, and I'm very interested in anti-Semitism as a concept recently, also probably because living in Germany raises this issue, and about the connection between what we call anti-Judaism, which is considered to be a Christian thing. It's more complicated than that, but this is like the Christian historical perspective on Jews and Judaism is usually captured through this term, while anti-Semitism is the new racist, biologically based 19th, 20th century attitude to Jews in Europe. And here again we see this era change. And I'm not saying that there wasn't a change within these ages, but it seems to me interesting to revisit this in light of also revisiting what secularism means and how secularism is related to religion in terms of this division of time, right? The religion that is somehow superseded by the secular, which also brings to mind Christian conceptions of Judaism. So I would like to explore this connection, how we can challenge the concept of secularism and the concepts of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism together. What happens if we combine these discourses, and does it help us analyze the huge and fascinating political contemporary debates on the concept of anti-Semitism and how it works out, how it plays out in different political contexts?
Thank you so much. And so before we turn to audience questions, can we have a round of applause for our panelists?